The crack echoed across the empty prairie like a gunshot, and Katherine felt her stomach drop as the wagon lurched violently to one side, nearly throwing her from the driver's bench. She pulled hard on the reins, bringing the two horses to a halt as dust swirled around the tilting wagon, her heart hammering against her ribs, while she tried to steady her breathing and assess what had just happened. "Easy now, easy," she murmured to the horses, setting the brake before climbing down to inspect the damage. The September sun beat down mercilessly on the Colorado plains, and sweat already dampened her collar as she circled the wagon. What she found made her curse under her breath, something her late mother would have scolded her for. The rear left wheel had split clean through 3 spokes, the wood splintered and hanging at an angle that made the whole structure look like it might collapse at any moment. Julia pushed a strand of dark hair from her face and looked around at the vast emptiness surrounding her. She had maybe another 30 miles to reach Durango, but she might as well have been 1,000 miles away for all the good it did her. She knew nothing about fixing wagon wheels, and the few tools her father had owned were meant for carpentry, not repairs like this. The sun climbed higher as she stood there, trying to formulate some kind of plan. She could try to ride one of the horses bareback into town, but that would mean leaving everything she owned behind on a trail where anyone could happen upon it. She could try to repair it herself, but without knowledge or proper materials, she would likely make things worse. Or she could wait and hope someone came along before nightfall, though she had not seen another soul since yesterday afternoon. Julia was just considering unhitching one of the horses when she heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching from the north. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by apprehension. Travelers on these lonely stretches could be helpful or dangerous, and she had no way of knowing which until they arrived. She reached into the wagon and pulled out her father's old rifle, checking that it was loaded before setting it within easy reach against the wheel. Better to be cautious. The rider came into view a few minutes later, a lone figure on a dark bay horse, and as he drew closer, Julia could make out more details. He sat tall in the saddle with the easy confidence of someone who had spent most of his life on horseback, wearing a worn brown hat, dusty pants, and a dark blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. A gun belt hung low on his hips, and a rope was coiled at his saddle. He looked to be in his late 20s, with several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw. He slowed his horse as he approached, his eyes taking in the scene with what looked like practiced assessment. "Looks like you have run into some trouble," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "The wheel split," Julia replied, keeping her voice steady. She stayed close to the wagon, aware of where the rifle rested. "Just happened about a half hour ago." The rider dismounted with fluid grace and walked closer, leading his horse by the reins. As he came nearer, Julia could see his face more clearly, the strong jaw, the gray eyes that seemed to miss nothing, the sun-weathered skin of someone who worked outdoors. There was something solid about him, dependable, though she reminded herself that appearances could deceive. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked, stopping a respectful distance away. Julia nodded and stepped aside. He handed his horse's reins to her without asking, an oddly trusting gesture, and then crouched down beside the damaged wheel. His hands moved over the broken spokes with surprising gentleness, testing the damage, checking how the wheel sat against the axle. After a long moment, he stood and pushed his hat back slightly, revealing dark hair damp with sweat. "It is bad, but not hopeless," he said, meeting her eyes directly. "I have some materials in my pack that might work. I can jury-rig something that should hold until you reach town." "You are heading to Durango?" "Yes," Julia said, surprised by the sudden tightness in her throat. The relief of having help, real help, made her realize just how frightened she had been. "My aunt lives there. I am coming from Denver." "That is a long journey to make alone," he observed, but there was no judgment in his tone, just a statement of fact. My name is Zachary Palmer. I have a ranch about 15 miles west of Durango. Been up north dealing with some cattle business. Katherine, she offered, relaxing slightly. I appreciate any help you can give. I will pay you for your time and materials. Zachary shook his head as he walked back to his horse and began unpacking his saddlebags. No payment needed. Out here we help each other. Never know when you might be the one needing it. He pulled out several pieces of rawhide cord, some strips of leather, and a few small tools. I am going to have to take the wheel off to work on it properly. Might take an hour or two. I have time, Julia said with a slight smile. Not like I am going anywhere. She watched as Zachary set to work, his movements efficient and purposeful. He used a jack from her wagon to lift the rear end, supporting it with rocks he gathered from the surrounding area. The broken wheel came off with some effort, and he laid it flat on the ground to examine it more closely in the full sunlight. Julia brought him water from her barrel without being asked, and he accepted it gratefully, drinking deeply before returning to his task. You know your way around repairs, Julia observed, settling on a nearby rock to watch. The shade from the wagon provided some relief from the heat, and she was content to rest after the shock of the morning. My father taught me, Zachary replied. Working rawhide cord through holes, he was carefully drilling into the wood near the split spokes. He always said a rancher needs to know how to fix anything, because you cannot always count on having a blacksmith or carpenter nearby when something breaks. I have repaired more wheels, fences, saddles, and roofs than I can count. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, Zachary said, and something in his tone told Julia the man was no longer alive. He started the ranch 30 years ago, built it from nothing. When he died 5 years back, he left it to me and my younger brother. We run it together now, mostly cattle with some horses. Julia found herself relaxing as they talked, the initial wariness fading as Zachary worked and shared bits of his life. He asked her about Denver, about her journey, and she found herself telling him about her father's death, the loneliness of the past months, the letter from an aunt she barely remembered. It is strange, she admitted, traveling all this way to live with someone I have not seen since I was a child. But there was nothing left for me in Denver. My father was all I had, and after he died, the city felt too big and too empty at the same time. Zachary looked up from his work, his gray eyes thoughtful. Starting over takes courage. Durango is a good town, growing fast with the railroad coming through. Your aunt is lucky to have you coming to help her. I hope she feels that way, Julia said with a soft laugh. Her letter was not exactly warm. More like she was doing her duty by offering me a place. Maybe she just does not know how to express herself in writing, Zachary suggested, returning his attention to the wheel. He was binding the split spokes together with the rawhide, wrapping it tightly and methodically, reinforcing the weak points with strips of leather that he secured with small metal brads. Some people are better in person than on paper. The sun had moved considerably across the sky by the time Zachary finally stood back and examined his work. The wheel looked different than it had before, wrapped and reinforced in several places, but it also looked solid, stable. He lifted it with a grunt and fitted it back onto the axle, securing it carefully before lowering the wagon back down. Let me walk around it a few times, test the weight distribution, he said, leading Julia's horses in a slow circle. The wagon moved smoothly, the repaired wheel holding steady. After 3 full rotations, he stopped and nodded with satisfaction. This should hold until town, he announced, wiping his hands on his pants. Just take it slow and steady, no racing or sudden turns. Once you get to Durango, have the wheelwright look at it properly. What I did here is temporary, but it will get you there safe. Julia walked over to inspect the repair, genuinely impressed by the neat, tight work. This is remarkable. You have probably saved me days of trouble, maybe worse. Thank you seems inadequate. Zachary smiled for the first time, and it transformed his face, softening the hard edges and reaching his eyes. You are welcome. Like I said, we help each other out here. He began gathering his tools and repacking his saddlebags. I need to get moving if I want to make home before dark, but Durango is straight south on this trail. You should reach it by tomorrow afternoon if you keep a steady pace. There is a good spot to camp about 10 miles ahead, near a creek with some cottonwood trees. You will know it when you see it. Julia felt an unexpected reluctance as she watched him prepare to leave. In just a few hours, Zachary Palmer had become a reassuring presence, solid and capable, and the thought of continuing alone suddenly seemed much lonelier than it had that morning. Will you be coming into Durango anytime soon? She found herself asking. He paused in the act of mounting his horse and looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. I come in most weeks for supplies and to check on business matters. The ranch is not far, like I said. Why do you ask? Julia felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. I thought perhaps I could repay your kindness with a meal, once I am settled. It seems only right. Zachary's smile returned, slower this time but warmer. I would like that. Your aunt runs the boarding house on 3rd Street, the big yellow one with the wraparound porch. Everyone in town knows it. I will stop by in a week or so, see how you are settling in. I will look forward to it, Julia said, and meant it more than she expected. She watched him ride away, his figure gradually growing smaller against the vast landscape until he disappeared over a rise. Only then did she climb back onto the wagon bench, gather the reins, and start her horses moving again. The wheel held steady beneath her, and she found herself thinking not about the miles ahead, but about gray eyes and capable hands and a smile that had made her heart beat a little faster. The camping spot Zachary had mentioned was exactly where he said it would be, a small grove of cottonwood trees beside a clear creek that bubbled over smooth stones. Julia unhitched the horses and let them drink and graze while she set up her simple camp, a bedroll beneath the wagon and a small fire for cooking. The evening air cooled quickly once the sun set, and she wrapped herself in a shawl as she ate beans and hardtack, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. Sleep came easier than she expected, and she woke to a pink dawn and the sound of birds in the cottonwood branches. After a quick breakfast and tending to the horses, she was back on the trail as the sun climbed, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. The wheel continued to hold, Zachary's repairs proving as solid as he had promised. Durango appeared in the early afternoon, first as a smudge on the horizon, then gradually resolving into buildings and streets as she drew closer. It was bigger than she had expected, a thriving town with brick storefronts, a train depot, hotels, saloons, churches, and houses spreading out in all directions. The main street bustled with activity, wagons and horses, and people going about their business with purposeful energy. Julia found 3rd Street easily enough and spotted the yellow boarding house immediately. It was indeed large, 3 stories tall with a wraparound porch just as Zachary had described, and flower boxes beneath the windows that overflowed with late-season blooms. She pulled the wagon to a stop in front and sat for a moment, gathering her courage. The front door opened before she could climb down, and a woman emerged onto the porch. She was perhaps 60 years old, thin and upright with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was lined but not unkind, and her eyes, the same dark brown as Julia's own, assessed her niece with frank curiosity. "Julia?" the woman called out. "Yes, Aunt Margaret," Julia replied, climbing down carefully. Her legs felt stiff from the long drive, and she stumbled slightly on the last step. Margaret came down the porch steps with surprising quickness and caught Julia's elbow, steadying her. Up close, Julia could see the resemblance to her own father. The same strong nose and determined chin, the same direct gaze. "You look half-starved and completely exhausted," Margaret said bluntly. "How long have you been traveling?" 5 days total from Denver," Julia admitted. "I had some trouble yesterday with a broken wheel, but a rancher helped me repair it." Margaret's eyebrows rose. "A rancher helped you? Out on the trail alone?" "His name was Zachary Palmer. He said he had a ranch west of town." "Zachary Palmer?" Margaret repeated, and something shifted in her expression, a softening around the eyes. "Yes, I know the Palmers. Good family, solid reputation. The brother owns the ranch with him, Thomas, comes into town more often than Zachary does. You were fortunate he came along. Come inside now, let us get you fed and rested. We can deal with the wagon and your things after." The interior of the boarding house was cool and welcoming, with polished wood floors, comfortable furniture, and the smell of something delicious cooking. Margaret led Julia to the kitchen, a large room at the back of the house with windows overlooking a garden, and sat her down at a scarred wooden table before ladling out a bowl of stew from a pot on the stove. "Eat," Margaret commanded, setting fresh bread beside the bowl. "Then you can tell me everything." Julia ate, suddenly ravenous, while Margaret bustled around the kitchen with brisk efficiency. The stew was rich with beef and vegetables, the bread still warm from baking, and Julia felt strength seeping back into her body with each bite. When she finally set down her spoon, Margaret sat across from her with 2 cups of coffee. "Now then," Margaret said, "let us speak plainly. You received my letter and came because you have nowhere else to go. That is the truth of it, yes?" Julia nodded, appreciating the directness even as it stung slightly. "My father died last winter. There was nothing to keep me in Denver, and you are my only family. Your father was my younger brother, and I loved him dearly, even though we had not seen each other in 20 years, Margaret said, her voice softening slightly. "When I heard about his death, it grieved me deeply. I should have written sooner, should have reached out, but I am not good with words on paper. I am glad you came, Julia. This house is too big for one person, and I am not getting any younger. I need help running it, and I can offer you a home, work, and a share of the profits. Does that sound acceptable?" Relief washed through Julia, so powerful it made her eyes sting. "More than acceptable. Thank you, Aunt Margaret. Call me Margaret, just Margaret," the older woman said briskly, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. "We will get your things unloaded and your wagon seen to this afternoon. The wheelwright is 2 streets over, and he owes me a favor. You can have the room on the 3rd floor, the corner one with windows facing south and west. It gets good light." The next few days passed in a blur of activity as Julia settled into her new life. The boarding house had 6 guest rooms, currently all occupied by a mix of traveling salesmen, miners, and railroad workers. Margaret ran a tight ship, expecting cleanliness, punctuality, and respectful behavior from her guests, and Julia quickly learned the routines of cooking, cleaning, laundry, and maintenance that kept everything running smoothly. It was hard work, harder than anything Julia had done in Denver, but she found satisfaction in it. Margaret was a demanding but fair employer, quick to correct mistakes but equally quick to praise good work. The guests were generally polite, and Julia learned to handle the occasional difficult personality with the same firm courtesy Margaret demonstrated. A week passed, then another, and Julia found herself watching for Zachary Palmer each time the front door opened or someone knocked. She told herself she was being foolish, that he had probably forgotten his casual promise to stop by, that a rancher had more important things to do than visit a woman he had helped on the trail. But she could not quite stop the small leap her heart made each time she heard footsteps on the porch. It was late on a Tuesday afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival, when he finally appeared. Julia was in the front parlor, mending linens while Margaret dealt with the supper preparations. When she heard the heavy tread of boots on the porch steps, she looked up as the door opened, and there he was, hat in hand, looking somehow both familiar and different in clean clothes with his hair neatly trimmed and his face freshly shaved. "Miss Katherine," he said with a slow smile that sent warmth flooding through her. "I hope I am not calling at an inconvenient time." Julia set aside her mending, acutely aware of her plain work dress and the strand of hair that had escaped her bun. "Not at all, Mr. Palmer. Please, come in." He stepped into the parlor, seeming to fill it with his presence despite the spacious dimensions. "I wanted to check how you were settling in, and whether that will made it all the way to town without trouble." "It held perfectly, just as you said it would," Julia assured him. "The wheelwright said your repair work was some of the best he had seen, that you could have a second career if ranching ever fails you." Zachary laughed, a rich sound that made Julia smile in response. "I will keep that in mind. And how are you finding Durango?" "It must be quite different from Denver. Smaller but no less busy," Julia said. "My aunt has been teaching me the boarding house business. There is always something that needs doing." They talked easily, the conversation flowing as naturally as it had on the prairie, and Julia found herself relaxing into the same comfortable rapport they had shared before. Margaret emerged from the kitchen after a while, wiping her hands on her apron, and her sharp eyes took in the scene with obvious interest. "Mr. Palmer," she said warmly, "it has been too long since you visited. Will you stay for supper? We have more than enough." Zachary glanced at Julia as if seeking her approval, and she nodded encouragingly. "I would be honored, Mrs. Katherine," he said. "It is Miss Katherine, I never married," Margaret corrected. "But everyone calls me Margaret. Come through to the dining room." Julia set another place. Supper that evening was a lively affair, with all 6 boarders present along with Zachary, Margaret, and Julia. The conversation ranged across various topics, from railroad expansion to mining prospects to the upcoming territorial elections, and Julia noticed how Zachary contributed thoughtfully without dominating the discussion. He had an easy way with people, drawing out the quieter guests and deflecting the more bombastic ones with humor. After the meal, as Julia cleared dishes, Zachary helped without being asked, carrying plates to the kitchen despite Margaret's protests that he was a guest. Julia found herself working beside him at the washing basin, her hands in soapy water while he dried with a towel, and the domestic intimacy of it made her heart race. "Your aunt is quite a character," Zachary observed quietly, his shoulder nearly brushing Julia's as he reached for another wet plate. "She is remarkable," Julia agreed. "Formidable but kind. I am lucky she took me in." "I think she might say the same about you," Zachary said, and when Julia glanced at him, she found him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. He stayed until the last dish was dried and put away, then retrieved his hat from the parlor and turned to Julia at the door. "Would you take a walk with me sometime?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "There is a nice path along the river, good for evening strolls." "I would like that very much," Julia replied, her pulse hammering in her throat. "Sunday afternoon? I could call for you at 3. "Sunday at 3, Julia confirmed, and the smile he gave her stayed with her long after he had gone. The days until Sunday seemed to crawl by, each one longer than the last. Julia threw herself into her work, trying not to count the hours, but Margaret noticed her distraction and commented on it with characteristic bluntness Friday morning while they kneaded bread together. "You are thinking about Zachary Palmer," Margaret stated rather than asked. Julia felt heat flood her cheeks. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who has eyes and has been watching you," Margaret replied dryly. "He is a good man, Julia. Hardworking, honest, treats people fairly. His father was the same way, and his mother was one of my dearest friends before she passed. But ranch life is not easy, especially for a woman. You should know that before you let yourself get too attached. We are only going for a walk, Julia protested weakly. Margaret gave her a knowing look. Walks lead to other things. I am not warning you away from him, child. I am just saying be sure you know what you want. You have only been in Durango a few weeks. There is no rush. But Julia already knew what she wanted. Had known it from the moment Zachary crouched beside her broken wagon wheel with gentle hands and capable confidence. She wanted more afternoons like the one on the prairie, more evenings like the supper they had shared. She wanted to know everything about him, his dreams and fears and the small details that made up his daily life. The intensity of her feelings frightened her slightly, this sudden certainty after such brief acquaintance, but she could not deny it. Sunday arrived bright and clear, autumn crispness in the air tempering the afternoon warmth. Julia changed her dress 3 times before settling on a dark green cotton with small white flowers, simple but flattering, and she took extra care with her hair, pinning it up in a style that was both neat and softening around her face. Margaret watched these preparations with a small smile but said nothing. Zachary arrived precisely at 3, dressed in clean dark trousers and a white shirt that emphasized his broad shoulders, his hat in hand and his boots polished. Julia met him on the porch, and the way his face lit up when he saw her made all her nervous preparation worthwhile. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering his arm. They walked through town toward the river, past houses and shops and churches, exchanging greetings with people Zachary seemed to know. Several gave Julia curious looks, and she knew by tomorrow the whole town would be talking about Zachary Palmer walking out with the new girl at Katherine's boarding house. The thought should have bothered her, but instead filled her with a strange pride. The river path was as lovely as Zachary had promised. A packed dirt trail that wound along the water's edge beneath towering cottonwoods that had turned golden with the season. The river itself ran clear and quick, sunlight dancing on its surface, and the sound of it was soothing. They walked slowly, in no hurry, and talked about everything and nothing. Zachary told her about the ranch, the daily rhythms of cattle work, the challenges of drought and disease and market prices. He spoke of his brother Thomas, 5 years younger and more social, who handled most of their business dealings in town, while Zachary preferred the solitude of working the land. He described the house their father had built, sturdy and sprawling, with a view of the mountains to the east and endless grassland to the west. Julia shared her own stories, her childhood in Denver with a father who worked as a carpenter, the tight-knit immigrant neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business, the slow decline after her father fell ill, the strange emptiness of being truly alone for the first time in her life. "I keep thinking about that day on the trail," Zachary said after a comfortable silence. "How you were handling everything so calmly when I rode up. A lot of people would have been panicking, but you were already thinking through your options, trying to solve the problem." "I was terrified," Julia admitted with a laugh. "I was just good at hiding it." "Courage is not the absence of fear," Zachary said seriously. "It is acting despite it. You have a lot of courage, Julia Katherine." The way he said her name, soft and deliberate, made her shiver despite the warm afternoon. They had stopped walking without her realizing it, standing close together beneath a particularly large cottonwood whose leaves rustled gently overhead. Zachary's gray eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and seen in equal measure. "I have not been able to stop thinking about you," he said quietly. "Not since that day. I know it has not been long. I know we hardly know each other. But I would like to change that. I would like to spend time with you, get to know you properly, if that is something you want as well." Julia's heart felt too large for her chest, beating so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. "Yes," she managed. "Yes, I want that too." His smile was slow and warm and filled with relief, and when he took her hand in his, carefully, giving her every chance to pull away, she laced her fingers through his instead. They stood there for a long moment, hands clasped, before continuing their walk along the river. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern that felt both thrilling and comfortable. Zachary came to town twice a week, always with some practical excuse, supplies to purchase or business to conduct, but he always made time to see Julia. Sometimes they walked along the river again. Sometimes they sat on Margaret's porch in the cooling evenings and talked while Margaret sat nearby with her knitting, a chaperone who gave them as much privacy as propriety allowed. Julia learned the subtle signs of hard physical labor in the tension of Zachary's shoulders, the calluses on his hands, the deep fatigue that sometimes shadowed his eyes despite his smile. She learned that he was patient and thoughtful, slow to anger but immovable once he set his mind to something. She learned that he loved the land with a passion that was almost spiritual, that he could talk for hours about grass quality and water rights and breeding lines but would go quiet and uncertain when trying to express his feelings. Zachary learned that Julia had a quick mind and a sharp tongue she tried to keep in check, that she worked harder than anyone he knew except perhaps his brother, that she worried constantly about being a burden despite Margaret's repeated assurances. He learned that she was fierce in defense of others but harsh on herself, that she missed her father with an ache that would probably never fully heal, that she was determined to build a life here that meant something. They learned each other slowly and carefully, building something solid from those first tentative foundations. October gave way to November, and the weather turned cold, frost painting the windows each morning and with smoke hanging heavy in the air. Julia had been in Durango nearly 3 months, and the boarding house felt like home now, Margaret like the family she needed. The work was still demanding but no longer overwhelming, and she had developed her own routines and relationships with the regular boarders. Zachary had not been to town in over a week, kept away by early snows in the high country that required moving cattle to lower pastures, and Julia found herself missing him with an intensity that surprised her. She caught herself watching the street, listening for his distinctive knock, and Margaret finally took pity on her on a Thursday afternoon. "Take the afternoon off," Margaret said firmly. "You have been working yourself ragged. Go visit Sarah Miller. She has been asking after you. Or take a walk. Just get out of this house for a few hours before you wear a hole in the floor with your pacing." Julia started to protest but saw the knowing look in Margaret's eyes and relented. She bundled herself in a heavy shawl and walked into town, ostensibly to visit Sarah, a friendly woman who ran the dry goods store and had befriended Julia soon after her arrival. But her feet seemed to carry her of their own accord toward the edge of town, toward the road that led west toward the Palmer ranch. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that she could not simply walk 15 miles out to his ranch uninvited, but she could not quite make herself turn back. She walked until the houses thinned and disappeared, until there was just the road stretching ahead through golden grassland beneath an enormous sky. The mountains rose in the distance, snow-capped and majestic, and she understood suddenly why Zachary loved this land so much. There was a freedom in the vastness, a sense of possibility that was both thrilling and terrifying. She was about to turn back, accepting the foolishness of her impulse, when she heard hoofbeats approaching from the west. Her heart leaped before her mind could catch up, and then there he was, Zachary on his dark bay horse, riding toward her with surprise and pleasure warring on his face as he recognized her. He reined to a stop beside her and swung down from the saddle in one smooth motion. "Julia, what are you doing out here?" "Being foolish," she admitted with an embarrassed laugh. "Margaret told me to take the afternoon off, and I started walking, and somehow I ended up here." Zachary's smile was brilliant. "I was just coming into town to see you. We finished with the cattle yesterday, and I have been going crazy stuck at the ranch all week." He glanced at the sky, assessing the angle of the sun. "We have a few hours of daylight left. Would you like to see the ranch? I can ride you out and bring you back before dark. Julia knew she should say no, knew that riding out alone with him to his home was pushing the boundaries of propriety. But she found herself nodding before caution could override desire. Zachary's grin widened, and he mounted his horse before reaching down to pull her up behind him. Julia settled onto the horse's broad back, her arms around Zachary's waist, and tried not to think about how solid and warm he felt, how right this seemed. The ride to the ranch took about 40 minutes at an easy canter, and Julia watched the landscape roll by with fascination. The grassland seemed endless, broken occasionally by rocky outcroppings or small groves of pinyon pines. Cattle grazed in scattered groups, looking fat and healthy, and once they startled a small herd of pronghorn that bounded away with effortless grace. The ranch buildings appeared gradually, nestled in a small valley with a creek running through it. The house was exactly as Zachary had described, sprawling and solid, built from local timber with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Barns and corrals spread out behind it, orderly and well-maintained, and smoke rose from the chimney promising warmth inside. A man emerged from the barn as they rode up, younger than Zachary but with the same strong build and a similar set to his jaw. His hair was lighter brown, his eyes more green than gray, but the family resemblance was unmistakable. He stared at Julia with undisguised curiosity as Zachary helped her down from the horse. "Thomas, this is Julia Katherine," Zachary said, and Julia heard the slight tension in his voice, the unspoken warning to his brother to behave. "Julia, my brother Thomas." "Miss Katherine," Thomas said, sweeping off his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I have heard a great deal about you. My brother has been utterly useless for weeks, mooning around like a lovesick calf. It is good to finally meet the woman responsible." "Thomas," Zachary said warningly, but Julia laughed, charmed despite herself by the younger man's teasing grin. "It is good to meet you too," she said warmly. "Zachary has told me you handle the business side of things. That must take considerable skill." Thomas preened slightly at the compliment. "Someone has to have a head for numbers. Zachary is brilliant with the land and the animals, but he would sell our cattle for half what they are worth just to avoid haggling." He glanced between them with frank interest. "Will you be staying for supper? I was just about to start cooking." Julia glanced at the sky, already starting to deepen toward evening. "I should get back before dark. Margaret will worry." "Then let me show you around quickly," Zachary said, "and we can ride back. I will stay in town tonight and return tomorrow." He led her on a brief tour while Thomas disappeared into the house, pointing out the different buildings and explaining their purposes. The barn was spacious and clean, with several horses in the stalls that nickered greetingly when Zachary approached. The corrals were well built, the fences sturdy and straight. Everything spoke of hard work and attention to detail, of pride in ownership. "My father built most of this," Zachary said as they stood on the porch looking out over the land. "Started with just the house and one small barn, and gradually expanded as the herd grew. Thomas and I have added some improved things, but the foundation is all his work." "You must miss him terribly," Julia said softly. "Every day," Zachary admitted. "But I feel close to him here working the land he loved. It is a good way to honor his memory, keeping the ranch thriving." He turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Julia, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." Her heart started to race. "All right. Could you be happy here?" he asked quietly. "Not right now, I am not asking that, but eventually. Could you see yourself living ranch life, the isolation, the hard work, the uncertainty? Because I need to know before we go any further. I am falling in love with you, and if you cannot see a future here, I need to stop now before I fall any harder." Julia felt tears spring to her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice, the vulnerability it took for him to ask. She looked out at the land, the rolling grassland and distant mountains, the big sky overhead. She thought about the boarding house, about Margaret, about the life she was building in Durango. And she realized that what she wanted most was not a place but a person. This man who fixed broken wheels and spoke carefully about his feelings and worked himself to exhaustion because he loved the legacy his father left him. "Yes," she said clearly, turning to meet his eyes. "I can see it. I can see myself here with you. I am falling in love with you too, Zachary Palmer, and I want a future with you, wherever that is." The relief and joy that flooded his face was answer enough, and when he reached for her, she went willingly into his arms. They stood on the porch wrapped in each other, and Julia felt something settle deep in her chest, a sense of rightness and homecoming that had nothing to do with buildings or land and everything to do with the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. The ride back to Durango was slower, more reluctant, both of them aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. Zachary left her at Margaret's door with a promise to call the next day, and Julia floated inside to find her aunt waiting in the parlor with a knowing expression. "You went to the ranch," Margaret stated. "How did you know?" "Because you have that look on your face that says something important happened," Margaret replied. "And because I may have encouraged you to walk in that direction when I sent you out this afternoon." Katherine, you schemer," Julia said, but without any heat. "Someone had to push you both along," Margaret said comfortably. "I am not getting any younger, and I would like to see my niece properly settled before I die." "Did he propose?" "Not yet," Julia admitted, "but we talked about the future. He asked if I could be happy on the ranch." "And you said yes, I imagine." "I did." Margaret nodded with satisfaction. "Good. He is a fine man, and you will make a good rancher's wife. You have the steel for it, even if you do not know it yet. Now help me start supper. The boarders will be complaining if we are late." The next weeks rushed by in a blur of preparation and planning. Zachary did propose, formally and properly, on one knee on Margaret's porch with a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. Julia said yes through happy tears, and Margaret opened a bottle of wine she had been saving for a special occasion. Thomas rode into town specifically to congratulate them, and Julia was touched by the genuine warmth in his embrace. They decided on a December wedding, giving them enough time to prepare but not so long that they had to endure months of waiting. Margaret threw herself into wedding preparations with an energy that belied her years, and Julia found herself swept along in a tide of decisions about flowers and food and guest lists. Sarah Miller insisted on making Julia's dress, and Julia spent several afternoons at the dry goods store being measured and fitted while Sarah chattered happily about romance and marriage and babies. The wedding itself took place on a crisp December afternoon in the small church at the edge of town. Nearly the entire town turned out, testament to the Palmer family's standing and Margaret's connections. Julia wore a simple but elegant dress of cream-colored wool, and Zachary stood at the altar in a new suit, his hair neatly combed and his eyes never leaving her face as she walked down the aisle. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, traditional vows spoken with voices that shook slightly with emotion. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Zachary kissed her with a tenderness that made Julia's heart overflow, and the congregation erupted in applause and cheers. The reception was held at the boarding house, which Margaret had transformed with greenery and candles and enough food to feed an army. Julia found herself passed from person to person, accepting congratulations and well wishes, watching Zachary do the same across the room. Their eyes kept finding each other through the crowd, sharing glances that promised later, soon, when they could be alone. As the evening drew to a close, they climbed into a wagon loaded with Julia's belongings, bundled against the cold, and started the journey to the ranch. Thomas had stayed behind to give them privacy, planning to spend the night in town, and Julia knew he would not return until the next afternoon at the earliest. The ranch house was warm when they arrived, fires already laid in the fireplaces and lamps lit throughout. Zachary carried Julia over the threshold with old-fashioned gallantry, and she laughed as he set her down carefully in the front room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Palmer," he said softly. "That will take some getting used to," Julia admitted, but the name felt right, felt earned. They moved through the house together, Zachary showing her everything properly now that it was her home too. The kitchen was well appointed, clearly designed by someone who knew their way around cooking. The sitting room was comfortable and lived in, with books on the shelves and a big window overlooking the creek. The bedroom was spacious and simply furnished, with a large bed covered in a colorful quilt and more of that glorious window light. Julia stood in the doorway, suddenly nervous now that the moment had arrived. Zachary came up behind her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "We can take this slow," he murmured against her hair. "There is no rush. We have all the time in the world." But Julia found she did not want slow, did not want to wait any longer. She turned in his arms and reached up to cup his face, studying the strong features she had come to love so deeply. "I am not afraid," she said truthfully. "Not with you." What followed was tender and awkward and sweet. Two people learning each other in the most intimate way possible, stumbling over clothing and nervousness and laughter until they found their rhythm. Julia had worried it might hurt or be uncomfortable, the way the whispered conversations among married women suggested. But there was only closeness and warmth and Zachary's careful attention to her comfort. They fell asleep tangled together, and Julia felt more at peace than she had since her father died. The next morning dawned clear and cold, and Julia woke to find Zachary already up, building up the fire and starting breakfast. She dressed quickly and joined him in the kitchen, still slightly shy in the morning light, but his easy smile and the coffee he pressed into her hands dispelled any lingering awkwardness. "Thomas will be back this afternoon," Zachary said as they ate. "But this morning is just ours. I thought I could show you more of the ranch, explain how everything works. You need to know the routines, in case anything ever happens and I am not here." Julia appreciated the practicality, the assumption that she would be a partner rather than just a decoration. They spent the morning touring the property on horseback, Zachary patient as Julia learned to handle the gentle mare he had chosen for her. He showed her the boundaries of their land, the best water sources, where the cattle tended to gather. He explained the seasonal rhythms, the spring calving and fall roundup, the constant work of fence maintenance and predator control. "It is a lot," he acknowledged as they sat on a rise overlooking the valley, the ranch buildings small below them. "And there will be times when you are alone for days while Thomas and I are out with the herd. But you are never truly isolated. Town is only an hour's ride, and Margaret will always welcome a visit. And when we are here together." "I am not afraid of hard work," Julia assured him. "And I am not afraid of solitude. I think I will come to love this place as you do." She was right. The first months of marriage had their challenges, the adjustment to ranch life demanding in ways Julia had not anticipated. She learned to cook on the big wood stove, to manage the household accounts, to tend the vegetable garden and preserve food for winter. She learned to read the weather and the animals, to trust her instincts when something seemed wrong. She learned to handle a rifle competently after Zachary insisted she know how to protect herself if needed. But there were joys too, unexpected and profound. Morning coffee on the porch watching the sun paint the mountains gold. Evenings by the fire reading aloud while Zachary mended tack. The quiet satisfaction of a job well done, a meal perfectly cooked, a garden flourishing. The nights wrapped in her husband's arms, learning each other's bodies and hearts with patient thoroughness. Thomas proved to be an easy brother to live with, cheerful and respectful of their privacy, treating Julia with genuine affection. He was courting a girl in town, the daughter of the bank manager, and Julia suspected there would be another Palmer wedding before too long. Spring came with dramatic suddenness, snow melting in torrents and grass erupting in waves of green. The cattle having kept all three of them busy around the clock, checking the herds constantly for cows in distress, pulling difficult births, tending to sick calves. Julia found she had a knack for the work, gentle hands and patience that made frightened animals trust her. She was checking a cow in the near pasture one April afternoon, Zachary working on a fence nearby, when she felt a sudden certainty that made her stop and press a hand to her stomach. She had missed her courses, not once but twice now, and the constant queasiness in the mornings had become impossible to ignore. "Zachary?" she called out, and something in her tone made him drop his tools and hurry over. "What is wrong? Is it the cow?" "The cow is fine," Julia said, her voice shaking slightly. "But I think I am with child." The expression that crossed his face was pure wonder, quickly followed by concern. "Are you certain? Have you seen a doctor?" "Not yet, but I am fairly certain. All the signs are there. I thought I should tell you first, before making it official." Zachary pulled her into his arms carefully, as if she might break. "A baby," he breathed. "Julia, this is wonderful. Terrifying, but wonderful." The doctor confirmed it the following week, estimating Julia was about 3 months along, the baby due in early November. Margaret was delighted, immediately beginning to knit tiny garments and offering advice that ranged from helpful to absurd. Thomas seemed bemused by the whole thing, teasing Zachary mercilessly about impending fatherhood while also quietly beginning construction on a cradle in the barn workshop. The summer passed in a haze of heat and growing discomfort as Julia's belly expanded. She continued working as long as she could, only reluctantly accepting restrictions as her balance changed and tasks became more difficult. Zachary was attentive to the point of being overprotective, until Julia finally had to tell him firmly that she was pregnant, not dying, and perfectly capable of cooking dinner without supervision. "I know," he said sheepishly. "I just worry. You are everything to me, Julia. You and this baby. If anything happened to either of you, I do not know what I would do." "Nothing is going to happen," Julia assured him, softening at the genuine fear in his eyes. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am healthy and strong, and we have a good doctor and Margaret helping. Everything will be fine." She maintained that confidence through the early fall, even as the baby grew active inside her, kicking strongly enough that Zachary could feel it when he rested his hand on her belly. They talked about names, debated possibilities, considered family traditions. Thomas lobbied strongly for his own name if it was a boy, and they laughed at his shamelessness. The first pains came on a cold November morning just after dawn. Julia woke Zachary calmly, told him to fetch the doctor and Margaret, and then focused on breathing through the contractions. By the time the doctor arrived, with Margaret close behind, the pains were coming regularly, and Julia had moved to the bedroom with towels and hot water standing ready. Labor was long and difficult, lasting through the day and into the night. Julia had thought she understood pain, but this was something beyond anything she had experienced. Waves of agony that left her gasping and weeping. Margaret stayed with her throughout, steady and encouraging, while the doctor checked periodically and pronounced everything progressing normally. Zachary paced in the front room, looking increasingly haggard, until Thomas finally forced whiskey on him and made him sit down. It was just past midnight when Julia finally felt the overwhelming urge to push, and after that, everything happened quickly. The baby came in a rush of fluid and blood and relief, and Julia heard the doctor's satisfied grunt followed immediately by a thin, angry wail that was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "It is a boy," the doctor announced, laying the squalling infant on Julia's chest. "A healthy boy with good lungs." Julia looked down at her son, red-faced and slick, tiny fists waving furiously, and felt her heart expand impossibly. He was perfect, absolutely perfect. She counted fingers and toes while Margaret cleaned him gently, and then the door burst open and Zachary was there, his face wild with hope and fear. "Julia? Are you all right?" "I am fine," she assured him, exhausted but exhilarated. "Come meet your son." Zachary approached slowly, almost reverently, and when Julia placed the swaddled baby in his arms, she watched her strong, capable husband break down in tears. He held the tiny bundle with infinite care, staring down at the small face with absolute wonder. "He is so small," Zachary whispered. "He will grow," Julia said with a tired smile. "Have you thought about what you want to name him?" They had discussed several options, but looking at his son, Zachary suddenly knew. "I want to name him after my father," he said quietly. "James Richard Palmer, if that is acceptable to you." "James," Julia repeated softly. "It is perfect. Hello, James. Welcome to the world." The next months were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feeding, learning the rhythms of caring for an infant. James proved to be a demanding baby, fussy and particular, but also sweet and curious, his gray eyes following movement with fascinated attention. Julia recovered slowly from the birth, grateful for Margaret's help in those first weeks when simply getting out of bed felt like a monumental achievement. Zachary was a devoted father, astonishing Julia with his patience. He would walk the floor for hours with James when the baby was fussy, humming tunelessly and swaying in a rhythm that seemed to soothe. He changed diapers without complaint, learned to warm bottles when Julia was too exhausted, and maintained the ranch work without letting it slip despite the new demands on his time. Thomas was an enthusiastic uncle, delighting in making the baby smile, and his courtship with the bank manager's daughter progressed to an engagement that spring. The wedding was planned for June, and Julia was secretly relieved to have months to recover fully before having to deal with another celebration. James grew quickly, reaching for toys, learning to roll over, developing a personality that was equal parts stubborn determination and sweet affection. He had Zachary's gray eyes and Julia's dark hair, and his smile could light up a room. Watching Zachary with their son, Julia felt a contentment so profound it was almost frightening in its intensity. The ranch prospered as well. Cattle prices were good that year, and Zachary and Thomas made several advantageous deals that left them financially secure. They were able to make improvements, adding on to the barn and hiring occasional help for the heaviest work. Julia's garden flourished, providing vegetables they sold in town along with eggs from the chickens she kept. On the evening of their second wedding anniversary, Julia and Zachary sat on the porch after putting James to bed, watching the sun set over the mountains. Julia leaned against her husband's shoulder, his arm around her waist, and thought about everything that had happened since that day on the trail when her wagon will split. "What are you thinking about?" Zachary asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "How strange life is," Julia said softly. 2 years ago, I was alone and frightened, stuck on the prairie with a broken wheel, and now I have everything I could ever want. A home, a family, a future, all because you stopped to help a stranger. "Best decision I ever made," Zachary said firmly. "Though I think we were always supposed to find each other. Call it fate or luck or providence. But that broken will brought you to me, and I will be grateful for it every day for the rest of my life." "You said it would hold until town," Julia remembered with a smile. "And it did. But what you built for me that day has held for much longer. This life, this love, this family. You fixed more than just my wagon, Zachary Palmer. You gave me everything." He turned her to face him, his eyes serious and full of emotion. "You gave me just as much. I was content before you, satisfied with my work and my life, but I was not truly happy. You brought joy and light and purpose beyond just maintaining what my father built. You made this place a real home." They kissed slowly, tenderly, as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared overhead. From inside the house came a small cry, James waking from his nap, and they smiled against each other's lips before separating. "Your turn," Julia said with a grin. "I will get him," Zachary agreed, standing and stretching. "You stay here, rest. It has been a long day." Julia watched him disappear into the house and then turned her gaze back to the land spread out before her. This beautiful, difficult, rewarding place that had become her home. She could hear Zachary's voice inside, soft and soothing as he talked to James, and her heart swelled with love. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own challenges and triumphs. James grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's calm temperament and his mother's quick mind. Thomas married his sweetheart in a joyful ceremony, and she moved into the ranch house for a year before they built their own home on the far edge of the property. Margaret's health began to decline slowly, and eventually she sold the boarding house and moved out to the ranch where Julia could care for her properly. Julia became pregnant again when James was 3, delivering a daughter they named Sarah after Julia's mother. She was an easier baby than James had been, placid and content, with her father's gray eyes and a sunny disposition that won everyone's heart immediately. 2 years later came another son, Robert, who proved to be adventurous and fearless, constantly getting into mischief. The ranch continued to grow and prosper under Zachary and Thomas's management. They built a reputation for quality cattle and fair dealing, and buyers came from as far as Denver to purchase from them. Julia managed the household with the same competence she had brought to Margaret's boarding house, and she also began raising chickens commercially, selling eggs and birds in town and discovering she had a head for business that surprised no one who knew her. Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep when Sarah was 5, and they buried her in the family plot they had established on a hill overlooking the valley. Julia grieved deeply for the aunt who had become more like a mother, who had given her a home when she needed it most, who had lived long enough to see her great nieces and nephews running around the ranch she loved. James grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved reading and learning, surprising everyone by expressing interest in becoming a lawyer rather than following his father into ranching. Zachary supported his son's dreams without hesitation, already setting aside money for education back east when the time came. Sarah was more interested in the land, following her father around from the time she could walk, learning everything he could teach her about cattle and horses and the rhythms of ranch life. Robert was still too young to show clear preferences, but he seemed to have inherited the Palmer mechanical aptitude, constantly taking things apart to see how they worked. On a spring morning when Julia was 33 and Zachary 38, they rode out together to check on a distant pasture, leaving the children with Thomas and his wife. It was a rare moment of solitude, and they savored it, riding slowly and talking about everything and nothing. They stopped at the same rise where Zachary had first shown Julia the full extent of the ranch, and they sat on a large rock looking out over the land they had built their life on. "Do you ever miss Denver?" Zachary asked, a question he had not posed in years. Julia considered it honestly. "Sometimes I miss the convenience of having shops nearby, and I occasionally think about the friends I had there. But no, I do not miss the city itself. This is my home, has been since the moment you fixed my wagon wheel and I saw you truly for the first time. I cannot imagine being anywhere else. I worried at first that you would regret it," Zachary admitted. "That ranch life would be too hard, too isolating. You gave up so much to be here with me." "I gained far more than I gave up," Julia said firmly. "A husband I love more with each passing year. 3 beautiful children. A place in the world that is uniquely mine. Purpose and satisfaction in my work. What could Denver have offered me that compares to that?" Zachary pulled her close, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the clouds drift across the enormous sky. Eventually they mounted up and continued their patrol, but Julia carried the moment with her, another perfect memory to add to the collection she had built over the years. The children continued to grow and change. James indeed left for law school when he turned 18, heading to St. Louis with his parents' blessing and financial support. Sarah took over more and more of the ranch work, demonstrating a natural talent for working with cattle that equaled or exceeded her father's. Robert decided he wanted to be a veterinarian, fascinated by animal health and medicine, and he began apprenticing with the local vet in Durango while still helping out at the ranch. Thomas and his wife had 4 children of their own, and the ranch that had once seemed vast now felt comfortably full of family. Holiday gatherings brought everyone together, and the big dining table Zachary had built could barely fit everyone when they all assembled. Julia would look around at these occasions, at the faces she loved, the children running around underfoot, the land visible through the windows, and feel a contentment so complete it was almost painful. She and Zachary maintained their own rituals over the years, the morning coffee on the porch when weather permitted, the evening walks down to the creek, the Saturday trips to town for supplies and socializing. They grew older together gracefully, silver threading through their hair, lines deepening around their eyes, their hands becoming rough and work-worn but still fitting together perfectly. On their 20th anniversary, Zachary surprised Julia with a trip back to the spot where they had first met, the stretch of trail where her wagon wheel had split. They camped there overnight, something they had not done in years, lying under the stars and remembering that day 2 decades earlier. "I knew right then," Zachary said quietly, his arm around her as they watched the moon rise. "The moment I saw you standing by that broken wagon, trying so hard to be brave when you were terrified. Something in my heart just recognized you, said here she is, this is the one. I thought I was crazy." "I felt it too," Julia confessed. "I told myself it was just relief at having help, gratitude for your kindness. But even then, I knew it was more. Watching your hands work on that wheel, the care you took with a job that was not your responsibility, the way you looked at me when you said it would hold until town. I was already falling in love with you, and I did not even know it yet." "Best broken wheel in the history of broken wheels," Zachary said with a grin, and Julia laughed. The sound carried away on the night breeze. They made love under the stars that night, their bodies familiar but no less exciting for that familiarity, and Julia felt the same spark she had felt on their wedding night all those years ago. This man, this life, this love had been worth every hardship, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt or fear. The years continued their inexorable march. Julia turned 40, then 45, then 50. Zachary's hair went entirely silver, and he moved a bit more carefully in the mornings, joints stiff from decades of hard physical labor. But they were still strong, still capable, still deeply in love with each other and the life they had built. James finished law school and returned to Colorado, opening a practice in Denver but visiting the ranch regularly with his wife and 2 children. Sarah married a neighboring rancher, a good man who understood her love for the land and supported her dreams of expanding their operations. Robert graduated from veterinary school and opened a practice in Durango, living in town but spending most of his free time at the ranch helping with the animals. Thomas's children were grown as well, some staying in ranching, others pursuing different paths, but all remaining close to the land that had shaped them. The Palmer name was respected throughout the region, synonymous with hard work, fair dealing, and strong family values. On a perfect autumn day when Julia was 55 and Zachary 60, they stood together at the spot where Zachary's parents were buried, and Zachary placed flowers on the graves with the same reverence he always showed. "They would be so proud of you," Julia said softly, taking his hand. "They would be proud of us," Zachary corrected. "Everything we built together. I could not have done any of this without you, Julia. You are the foundation of everything good in my life." "And you in mine," Julia replied, squeezing his hand gently. They walked back to the house slowly, in no hurry, content in each other's company. Smoke rose from the chimney where Sarah was cooking dinner for the extended family, children's laughter echoing across the yard as Thomas's youngest grandchildren played. It was a scene repeated countless times over the years, familiar and comforting. That evening, after the family had gone home and the house was quiet, Julia and Zachary sat on their porch watching the sun set in spectacular shades of gold and crimson and purple. This porch, this view, this moment had anchored their life together, a constant through all the changes and challenges. If you could go back, Zachary asked suddenly, to that day on the trail, knowing everything that would come after, all the hard work and heartache and struggle along with the joy, would you still get in that wagon and set out for Durango? Julia did not hesitate. Without question, every moment has been worth it, Zachary. The good and the bad, the easy and the hard. I would do it all again exactly the same way if it meant ending up here with you. Even the broken wheel? Especially the broken wheel, Julia said with a smile. Because that was when I found you, or you found me, or we found each other. However you want to phrase it, that broken wheel was the best thing that ever happened to me. Zachary kissed her softly, and Julia tasted 20 years of shared life in that kiss. Every joy and sorrow and moment in between distilled into simple, profound connection. When they finally pulled apart, the last light had faded from the sky, and stars were beginning to emerge overhead, the same stars they had watched together for 2 decades. Come on, Zachary said, standing and offering his hand. Let us go inside. It is getting cold. Julia took his hand and let him pull her to her feet, and together they walked into their home, closing the door against the night. Inside was warmth and light and the life they had built from a chance meeting on a lonely stretch of prairie. Inside was everything they had ever needed or wanted, all because a cowboy had stopped to help a woman with a broken wagon wheel and said the words that would change both their lives forever. This should hold until town. It had held far longer than that, spanning decades and generations, creating a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. From that moment of connection, that simple act of kindness, had grown an entire world, rich and full and deeply meaningful. Julia fell asleep that night in her husband's arms, the same place she had fallen asleep for 20 years, and dreamed of the future that stretched ahead of them still, the years they would continue to share, the love that had sustained them and would sustain them until the very end. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, spring yielding to summer, yielding to fall, yielding to winter, and back again. The ranch changed with them, buildings updated and expanded, technology slowly making its way into their operations, but the essential character of the place remained constant. It was still the Palmer Ranch, still built on the foundation Zachary's father had laid and maintained by hard work, integrity, and love. Julia and Zachary grew older gracefully, accepting the limitations that came with age without surrendering to them. They still rose early to watch the sunrise, still took their coffee on the porch when weather permitted, still walked down to the creek most evenings. Their pace was slower, their steps more careful, but their commitment to each other and to the land never wavered. Grandchildren came, more and more of them as the years passed, filling the house with noise and energy that Julia and Zachary welcomed despite the exhaustion it sometimes brought. They were the stable center around which the family orbited, the ones who remembered the early struggles and kept the stories alive, who maintained the traditions and values that defined who they were. On their 30th anniversary, the family threw a grand celebration at the ranch, with guests coming from all over Colorado and beyond. The house and yard overflowed with people, and Julia found herself surrounded by love in its many forms, children and grandchildren and nieces and nephews, old friends and respected colleagues. Zachary stood beside her as they cut the cake, his arm around her waist, and when they kissed, the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. 30 years, Zachary murmured against her lips, and I love you more now than I did the day we married. And I you, Julia replied, her eyes shining with happy tears. The party continued long into the night, but eventually Julia and Zachary slipped away to their bedroom, leaving the younger generation to carry on the celebration. They changed into their night clothes and climbed into bed, the same bed they had shared for 3 decades, and held each other in the darkness. "Do you remember the wedding night?" Julia asked softly. "How nervous we both were." Zachary chuckled, the sound rumbling in his chest beneath her ear. "I was terrified I would do something wrong, hurt you or disappoint you. Took Thomas getting me half drunk just to get through the day." "I did not know that," Julia said with surprise. "He swore me to secrecy," Zachary admitted. "But I figure after 30 years, the statute of limitations has expired. You were magnificent that day, Julia. You are magnificent every day." They made love then, slowly and gently, their bodies knowing each other intimately after decades of sharing. It was different than when they were young, less urgent but no less meaningful, a celebration of endurance and persistence and love that had weathered every storm. Afterward, as they drifted towards sleep, Julia thought about everything that had led her to this moment. The death of her father that had left her alone and adrift. The letter from an aunt she barely knew. The decision to leave Denver and travel to Durango despite everyone's warnings. The wagon wheel splitting on that lonely stretch of trail. The sound of hoofbeats approaching from the north. All of it, every single moment, had been necessary to bring her here, to this bed, to this man, to this life. She would not change a single thing, would not erase a single hardship, because they had all been essential in creating the woman she had become and the love she had found. "Thank you," she whispered, not sure if Zachary was still awake. "For what?" came his drowsy reply. "For stopping that day, for fixing my wheel, for seeing something in me worth pursuing, for building this life with me, for loving me so well for so long, for everything." Zachary's arms tightened around her, and she felt him press a kiss to the top of her head. "The pleasure and the privilege have been entirely mine, Mrs. Palmer. Thank you for saying yes, for taking a chance on a rancher and a life you knew nothing about. Thank you for every day of these 30 years. Thank you for being exactly who you are." Julia fell asleep smiling, secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, with exactly who she was supposed to be with, living exactly the life she was meant to live. The broken wagon wheel that had once seemed like a disaster had been instead a gift, a divine intervention, a moment of grace that had changed everything. And through all the years that followed, through joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle, growth and change, the words Zachary had spoken on that dusty trail echoed in Julia's heart as a promise that had been kept beyond measure. This should hold until town. It had held through town and past it, through decades and generations, building something far more enduring than a simple repair job on a broken wheel. It had held through the creation of a family, the building of a legacy, the crafting of a love story that would be told and retold by Palmer descendants for generations to come. The ranch continued on, managed eventually by Sarah and then by her children, but Zachary and Julia remained its heart for as long as they lived. They grew old together, watching the mountains change with the seasons, the creek run high in spring and low in late summer, the cattle cycle through the pastures, the family expand and flourish around them. Julia never forgot the young woman she had been at 23, alone and frightened on that prairie trail. But that woman felt like a distant memory, almost a different person entirely, shaped and transformed by years of love and work and purpose. She had become someone stronger, more capable, more certain of herself and her place in the world. And it had all started with a broken wheel, a cowboy's kindness, and a simple promise that had held far longer than anyone could have imagined. This should hold until town. Words that had changed 2 lives, created a family, and built a legacy that would endure for generations. Words that Julia carried in her heart for the rest of her days, a reminder of the moment when everything changed, when her real life began, when she found the home and love she had been seeking without even knowing it. The story of how they met became a family legend, told and retold at gatherings, embellished and expanded with each telling but always returning to the essential truth. A woman alone with a broken wagon. A cowboy who stopped to help. A repair job that was meant to last a few dozen miles but ended up lasting a lifetime. Love built on a foundation of kindness and competence and mutual respect, growing deeper and stronger with each passing year. Julia Palmer lived to see her great-grandchildren born, to watch the family she and Zachary had created flourish and expand, to know that the life they had built together would continue long after they were gone. And when she finally passed peacefully in her sleep at the age of 85, with Zachary holding her hand and their children gathered around, she died content in the knowledge that she had lived fully and loved deeply and left the world better than she found it. Zachary followed her a year later, his heart unable to continue without its missing half. They were buried together on the hill overlooking the valley, beneath a large stone that bore their names and the simple inscription. Together they built something beautiful, and the ranch continued on, generation after generation. Palmer family members carrying forward the values and traditions established by the couple who had met by chance on a prairie trail and chosen each other every day thereafter. The story of the broken wagon wheel and the cowboy who fixed it became part of the ranch's mythology, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes, that kindness to strangers can change lives, that love can be found in the most unexpected places. The land itself seemed to remember them, their presence woven into the very fabric of the place. The porch where they had sat together for decades still stood. The cottonwood trees they had planted still provided shade. The creek still ran clear over smooth stones. And on quiet evenings when the light was just right, it was easy to imagine them still there, sitting side by side watching the sunset, hands clasped, content in each other's company and the life they had shared. This should hold until town, Zachary had said on that long-ago day. And it had held through town and beyond, through decades of marriage, through the raising of children and grandchildren, through prosperity and hardship, through all the challenges life could throw at them. It had held because they had held it together, two people committed to building something lasting, something meaningful, something worth the effort it required. In the end, that broken wagon wheel had been the best thing that ever happened to either of them. The crack that echoed across the prairie, not an ending but a beginning, the start of everything good and beautiful and meaningful in both their lives. From that moment of crisis had come the greatest gift imaginable, a love that sustained them through everything, a partnership that made them both better than they were alone, a family that would carry their legacy forward into the future. And somewhere in heaven, if such a place existed, Julia and Zachary Palmer found each other again. Hands reaching out and clasping tight, gray eyes meeting brown with the same spark of recognition and love that had flared between them on that dusty trail so many years before. Together again as they had always been meant to be, for eternity. The wagon wheel had split, the cowboy had fixed it and said those words that would change everything, and from that simple beginning had grown a love story for the ages, a romance worthy of the wild and beautiful land that had shaped it, a testament to the power of kindness, courage, and choosing to open your heart even when you are afraid. The end came not as tragedy but as completion, a circle closed, a promise fulfilled, a journey ended in exactly the right place. Julia and Zachary Palmer had lived fully and loved deeply, and their story would be remembered as long as the ranch stood and the family gathered and the wind whispered through the prairie grass of the Colorado high country they had called home.